Hello, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight with you. I've been told that I should speak English, so sorry about that for the Serbian-speaking attendance. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here, especially after the last year in Sarajevo, which was also, I would say, a very successful event. And from the selection of the people who are invited here, I'm looking forward to have a very nice discussion in the next couple of days. As I was told from the organizer, we are supposed to speak about the scale. So in our office, which is based in Zagreb, Croatia, we have developed different scales, and we think that this is, I would say, a pretty important architectural tool that we can use in different ways to address the certain goals that we have to do as in our everyday practice. So generally speaking, scale is, I would say, a phenomenon that is not so easy to grasp and to understand. So I'm showing you a couple of artists' interventions which somehow question the scale. So is this a multi-story building, or is it a kind of a piece of infrastructure somehow found in a street? The same goes for this intervention. Is this kind of a ravine in a park, or is it really a kind of a drone picture of a settlement? So we should be careful when we look at the scale. So we can also learn a lot about from the commercials. This is one from a bank, which shows this immediacy between the public and the private. When we speak about the scales, I think it's very important also to tackle and to relate the public to the private. There are a number of nice examples showing these small scales embedded in the cityscape. I'm going very quickly through them, showing you different ideas how people intervene in a public space in order to make it more appealing, in order to make it more user-friendly and a part of a broader offer in a public realm. So there are different places, different styles. For example, this one is also very interesting, a kind of a glamping, a tent structure atop of a bigger structure. So the idea of combining the big scale and a small scale. There are very, I would say, inspiring examples. Somehow, as you can see by now, derived from the sphere of commercials, which we as architects can enhance for our own benefit in our projects. So this one is also interesting because it shows two scales at once. A billboard which is normally addressing the driver from the distance. In the same time, it's being used like a kind of a swing for a couple of Polish artists who made this performance, somehow questioning and tackling two different scales at once. Also a kind of a graphic used for Radiohead covers also tells us about different contents which are somehow interrelated and which show the interdependency between the different programs in the cityscape. This is how we can understand this image. Also, Jacques Tati shows us about the idea about compression. How to organize the flows of people within a single structure which is pretty compressed, pretty condensed, and works as such. The idea of space between the things, it's also very important. It's also kind of a small-scale structure, almost, I would say, ephemeral structure, but it's also interesting how this small scale generates the semi-public space within itself. I will also tell you in this beginning a few hints about the town I'm coming from. I particularly like this image of the city of Zagreb seen from the nearby mountain. And you see some sort of small-scale elements here in the foreground, and this sort of a nebula of cityscape which somehow is only a kind of a hint that we have to imagine how it looks like. So I think this sort of a magical appearance when we come near through these clouds. Then we come, to the main square, where we have a sequence of different scales and also of different stylistic epochs, one next to the other. Modernism next to the historicism, Art Nouveau next to rationalism, and so on and so on. So this is about the main square. in the city. Then we have a street which is called, or originally Proletarian Brigade, now it's called Vukovarska. A street which is made with modernist slabs in the beginning of the 50s. Even filmmakers like Orson Welles shoot the most of the exteriors in this street. The film is called The Trial, so if you have interest, you can have a look at it. And it's full of these slabs which have this sort of a Corbu-like radiance. This one is by the architect Galić. So it's somehow, this scale is appropriated for this new functionalist, modernist city that happened in the south of the city just after the World War II. It's also interesting, this little niche, this little gap for the smokers next to our city council. So this is a kind of a place where you can secludedly smoke your cigarette and be somehow protected from the winds. So this is a kind of, I would call it Herzbergerian space, this space that happens almost by chance, and people can use it if they know it. This is also kind of an idea how to use these little gaps in the city in order to park your little vehicles that almost do not exist today anymore. And it's also very interesting to see how intruders, people who have this credit card, can enter this comfort zone and have a nap or even stay there overnight. So these are, I would say, interesting issues, how to use the city, and for us as architects, how to understand these phenomena which are bizarre or haphazardly happening. So we should somehow observe this and try to make the best out of it in our reworking with that. This is the place where I teach, the city of Split, known as the Accretion Palace, 17 centuries old. After the 17th centuries, this is what became out of this city. The structure is still visible. It's also a kind of a scale which has been maintained. You can still see Cardo and Decumanus as these two principal axes, and the whole Roman structure that was organized around these axes. So this is also kind of a good way how to learn about the scale. This is how people trade in this part of the Mediterranean. So it's very ephemeral. It's very small scale, and of course it also is a kind of a necessity of us as architects to pay attention to that and to relate to that. So how to use a table tennis table? You can use it in different ways. Not to forget this little doggy who is also enjoying the shadow in the ground level, so to say. So these are all things that might eventually be understood as ironic or humoristic, but we as architects can certainly understand it. It doesn't take a lot to create a public space of a small scale. It's an example either from Split or from Dubrovnik. It can really be kind of a single staircase can be appropriated for gathering, for staying there and having a good time in the city. Now I will tell you what actually we have been asked to present here, and this is these small-scale projects which somehow relate to specifically to children. We did a lot of projects for kindergarten structures. Unluckily, only one of them was built, but this is a kind of a series of projects starting from 2002, ending up in the end of the first decade, showing a kind of an evolution of a type that consists of these two colors. The yellow are the dwelling areas for the kids, and the gray ones are additional structures for, we call it grown-ups. So the ways how we try to make it a theme is the way how we combine this, how we do not take one away from the other. How do we interweave these two generations, these two worlds into a kind of a more complex and more friendly and more social textile? The first one is relatively simple. It's been made in a circle because it's kind of a structure in the park. So we thought that we should somehow try to pack this orthogonal structure into a kind of a circular shapes, also providing with these shed roofs enough daylight into the structure. So this is how it sits in this park. So this was kind of a beginning of getting to know what these children's scale might be like. This is another one also in the park, as you can see here. So it also have to have all the sides, or if you call it elevations, equally important because it's like a pavilion. So we also sort of tried to deal with this slightly irregular shape and to punch out these courtyards in order to get the kids in the outer space and somehow to relate these courtyards to the classrooms. And this is kind of a view from the distance of this one. This is a plan showing this courtyards and the relation of the units, and let's call it semi-public space in between, and the space for the grown-ups, which is somehow adjacent to this one and somehow slightly interwoven. I will show you some more interweaving just right now. So this is basically the idea, not to take one part of the other, but somehow try to make them a bit more okay, so this is the idea that these two structures are not divided, but somehow more closely related in order to achieve different social relations. I will talk about it a bit more specifically just after this. This is a third example. Again, the idea of courtyards and the units in a relatively small lot in Zagreb. This is the volumetrics of this. And you can see a kind of a relation of the units and the spaces for administration. How are they related all around these courtyards with a multi-purpose room in the middle, and so on and so on. This is a kind of another study how these roofs could look like. Fourth type, as you can see, is somehow evolution of this type that we started to develop and to see how these courtyards can work between each other. And the idea that we have also a kind of a, it's also kind of a relation to Herzberger, how these gifted child can have a kind of a niche, a special place where they can have their own programs and they are still related to the unit which is here. So it's also kind of a structure which enables us to play different scenarios and different programs. So this is how this volumetrics looks from the outside. And this is slightly different because it's for a rural setting. So what we tried with this one in Kutina, it's a kind of a semi-rural, semi-urban situation in Croatia. So we studied these rural structures, how are they organized around the courtyards, and we somehow evolved this into kind of a kindergarten type. We also studied the roofs. The terrain is sloping, so these kind of canopies somehow follow certain patterns that are embedded in a history. And slightly, little by little, we try to make this dialogue between this, let's call it modern, urban, and the rural things of the past, which slightly and slowly go away. So we wanted to somehow to have this organization of urban and suburban in the same project. So this is, as you can see, the further development of the type that I already showed you. Again, this idea of not dividing but connecting. And this is the biggest one that we did in this series, with some sections and how it looks in this sloping terrain. This is one we call it. We invented the word timber garden because this was a competition for a kindergarten made out of timber, like a typical, like a prototypical object. So what we try to address here is a kind of a motherboard or big mama, how we call it, and we have these little wooden structures all over the settlement. It's in the west part of Zagreb. So there is a bus, there is a lorry which distributes food, and all these small-scale structures could be easily assembled on the site. Basically, the idea is that we have this wooden structure here, and we have these two plug-ins with all the technique and with the multi-purpose hall as something that you can plug in by demand if you really need it. This is a kind of a more poetic settlement of this kindergarten in a landscape, and we also use these huge trusses in order to play different scenarios how these kids' units could be used. Some more about the structure and the whole assembly of the building and how it can look in a more natural setting. And finally we come to this one that was built that is somehow a part of this series, and it is being done in the eastern part of the city on this lot where the old kindergarten existed. So, and you can see the huge building here casting pretty big shadows for biggest part of the year. So what we try to do is kind of organize this pad with all these structures, but as you can see there is a shadow, so we have to push this pad away from the shadow, but unluckily we arrived to the end of the site. So what can you do? You just fold the pad, so what is a kind of a atrium becomes a terrace, and so on and so on. So we played this game further, try to see how we can work with that. So this is the site plan of the whole structure. This is how it looks like with atria and these balconies. This is basically the structure. Sorry. The entrance and the units and the upper floors because of lack of the site. So we have to condense it as much as we can. So these are some things from the competition, how this structure could look like, how these elevated patios could look like terraces or loggias if you want. So this is some details from the building site, the idea of these volumes, the progression of the building site, some sections, some renderings for the competition, and finally how it came into being. This is the rear side showing these atria. And this is the plan actually, showing these main axes, and you see the distribution of these auxiliary program for the grown-ups. So this is the most important part of the project, not its formal things. We call it kids or children's street, because when kids stroll along this street, then they can see a woman typing on a typewriter, another one counting money, the third one sewing on a sewing machine, the fourth one cooking the meal, the fifth one mending some furniture. So kids have a kind of idea that they have introduction into the real life. So this is a kind of a idea that the kindergarten is a kind of a didactic device, not just a building, but it's a kind of a didactic device where kids are being brought by the grown-ups like a simulation of the real life that you would have walking along the street and seeing all these professions left and right, talking to these people, having some sort of relation, and this is how the socialization in this kindergarten could work like. So this is a few images to give you an idea how this transparency of these slabs works in order to relate the small ones to the big ones. We even use it as our Christmas card for 2008. Some more exteriors, some more sections. We even have it in the cover of our 2G magazine, this kind of a winter scene where kids can play in a secluded loggias or balconies. We use these indigo color, relating it to the indigo children. We don't have a time to talk about it in detail now, but just kind of a hint. If you have interest, you can have, there is a lot of it in the internet, what the indigo children are like. Some more details. This is also maybe interesting. We deliberately left this part of the lot without the fence. So we are giving to the city this kind of a park, like a kind of a obligation of the architects that they contribute the public domain. So this is not fenced as a private space of a kindergarten, but it's given over to the park. It was a kind of a very risky venture, trying to, and actually it happened because the people in the municipality didn't pay enough attention to what we were selling them. So this happened only by chance and probably couldn't be repeated next time. So some more images from the winter. And now I will show you, I hope in a very rapid progression, how do we deal with different scales and how do we relate it to different programs, which are not kindergartens, obviously, but other programs, and how do we try to use the idea of a scale or scalelessness, as you will see, as a decisive design tool. small. In a part of Croatia, in this hinterland, we were asked by a famous Croatian writer, Ante Tomic, to make him a kind of a holiday house where he can write his novels and things like that. So this is the site that they have. So we had the idea to draw this house only by making one single line. And everything else is either outside or the inside. There is a play about the stone walls and the other walls. So we enter here, this is his reading room, these are some bedrooms, this is the living area, so they are related to the outsides. To the outside, these places of concentrations are somehow more inward bound, so we try to orchestrate the whole scenario of living there just by having this one single line, which somehow continues the line of these dry walls, as you can see them here. They exist and they encircle, sorry. They encircle the whole site. So this is how it is in this very simple model, and these floating roofs, which somehow emphasize the different rooms and different programs. The next one is the project for a little gallery in the city of Zagreb next to the Academy of Arts. This is the main street of Ilica, and it was a competition where we were asked what to do with this gap. So we came out with the idea, so this is the gap seen from Ilica Street, how to deal with that. So we came with the idea to leave the gap open, again, to give this as a kind of an extra public space to the street area, and to reduce the house to the very condensed volume, which goes down and goes up. So this is the plan. I'm sorry about the quality of slides, but they should have been a bit better. So it's a very condensed area in the ground floor, and there are some exhibition floors. Upstairs here is just a plaza, entrance into the courtyard. So this is how it looks like. It's a kind of a brick structure. As you can see, it somehow goes into white, goes into nothing. So this idea of tour sans fin, as Noël would say, this is the idea of this single piece of brick with this very humble entrance, and this is the whole gesture. Everything else is on the inside, and this is this plaza with some public art and the sunken atrium, like, let's say, Mies van der Rohe, where you can see, from this plaza, you can see the exhibits in this, and it also gives the light to the galleries which are in the downstairs area. So this is the view from this lower part, looking up. This is the idea of having it very dark in the base and dissolving into the air. So we try to use some special agents for brick to make it normal, or to let these calcium penetrate it and to make it more white. So the idea of imperfection of the bricks, we use them as a design tool. And we leave it to see in the future how these red or whitish bricks would perform. So this was the whole narrative of the facade. So this is the rear elevation, and one more view from this Ilica Street site. The next one, some of you have visited it. I've heard it just now. It was our pavilion for 2009 Zagreb Salon, where we, as the winners of the former Salon, somehow, how can I say it, we gave ourselves the right to build this pavilion, otherwise people make exhibitions. So we said, let's try to start a new tradition that every winner of this previous round makes a kind of a little pavilion as a kind of a statement of Croatian architecture at that particular moment in time. So we have chosen this spot, and we are still sort of positive about this to become a new tradition. Just next to the main square is a kind of a, meadow which is not so used. It is next to the cathedral. It has a very direct relation. And we thought this could be a nice spot for this building, which has this public access, and this lawn is really not used. So we tried to make it here. So this is the site, relation to the main square, some ideas in the model, how to make it, relation to the film by Buster Keaton, 1 week. It's called the film. You can have a look. We don't have time to go into the narrative of the film, but somehow this is the idea of these prefab things which can go wrong, and the idea of the aesthetics of ugly, which we found very important in architecture. So we tried to make this monster and to say what is the most dominant material in architecture in Croatia at that moment. Plastic windows and rendered, we call it demit facade. I hope you're familiar with this term, demit. So demit is something that architects really despise and hate. I hope you agree with me. And plastic windows as well. So let's make this pavilion with these two mostly hated materials, and let's show that they still have a certain power to be articulated as architecture with big A. So this is a kind of a plan of this structure, some section. None of the windows are the same. This is the assembly process of the steel structure, building it, as you can see, and situating it next to the cathedral, and this is how it was finished. So it sits peacefully. There were a lot of different events happening inside related to the happenings in the main square, so it stood there for 3 months. In the interior, we have shown this film as a kind of idea that some of the people, not all of them, of course, could have this relation from this narrative of the film related to the very pavilion. So these are some views from the interior. This is quite intentional, this idea of this pulpit as if this were a little church. So this sort of a almost religious setting is quite intentional. Next to the Big Brother, the cathedral, we have very specific relation to the Catholic Church in Croatia. So we wanted to make a little comment on that to somehow work with some stereotypes and some cliches. Some magical appearance when it's lit, some different views, and so on. Okay, now we go to the middle-sized projects. I hope we are okay with the time, are we? First I will show you, we call it campus, believe it or not, but we call it campus in Split. It's a very strange campus with a lot of illegal building. It's very inclined. It is an idea of the 80s, of the so-called Split 3, as kind of diagonal, which is not really taken as it should be. This is the Faculty of Architecture here. So this was a competition for a new Faculty of Law. So we try to see how the whole things can work out. We don't have time to go into detail with it, but this is the position of the house. We call it the house with 3 courtyards. 4 different reasons, climatic and organizational reasons. And these are some references, of course, that we also cannot go into detail, but just to give you an idea how we assemble the whole narrative of the project. We also have the arches, which have different functions, which are somehow, and we have these steps, on one hand side Eisenstein, on the other hand side this scalinata as something typically Mediterranean. So on this sloping terrain, we make the parterre or ground floor as this sloping up, stepping up structure, like a parterre which happens on 3 levels. You can see it also here, how it goes up, because it's a kind of a pretty sloping, steep terrain. Some plans. In Dalmatia, the more arches you make, the more money you will make with your house, because it will be attractive. It became almost like kind of a trademark, so people try to apply them wherever they can. So we say, why shouldn't we go with the same banal idea, but let's make them double height, and let's see what happens when we use this as a pretext. There are also these Roman arches, which has been changed by time, by the everyday people. They punch a window, they put air conditioning thing here and things like that, but it still somehow does not compromise the strength of the structure, of this primary Roman structure. So this is a lesson that we learned from this and try to apply it into our project. So this is the most important diagram of the project. We have these arches as a kind of a disciplined structure, and we have the infill, which can change in time. You can close it, you can put a staircase somewhere else. This is a kind of a structure that really can change in time. This is the idea that architecture does not work as a kind of a petrified entity or a factum, but it's somehow a procedural living organism which can adapt to the very needs of its users. So this is the message that comes out of this project. We use some ready-made, some banal structures in order to make it also kind of a more related to the context that we have to work with. So these are these plastic boxes that we put into the interior, and this is a kind of an exterior view of this structure, also with these gardens protecting from the sun. So it's a beginning of something that we later on developed as a kind of a sustainable architecture. This I would eventually call proto-sustainable project, which somehow tackles these things, but on a very primitive level. Another faculty is a competition for a pharmaceutical faculty in Zagreb. This is just next to the main cemetery, a nice virginal plot of land next to the botanical garden, which also belongs to the faculty. So this is our second iteration of this competition. We came third 15 years ago in the first competition, which was published all over the world for some reasons that I really cannot really understand, but obviously it was interesting for someone. And now, 15 years later, we somehow have to face this site again with some new ideas how we can work with that. And this is a kind of idea how we can frame the nature in this format which is given. Of course, relating to the referentials like Paul Klee, the castle in the forest is the name of this painting that he made. So we tried to somehow to simulate this artificial forest that can also become a part of this forest-like structure here. So we plant some sort of artificial things there which can serve a number of purposes. Of course, we have references like Frank Lloyd Wright, like architect Corrales in Madrid, like Foster in Spain, like a pretext for our structure, and we put our pavilions within these structures like little pavilions in the forest. So we have these two entities. First we have these mushroom-like columns which perform a number of sustainable functions, but also have the structural properties. It carries the roof and the elevation, and within these we have the pavilions. So this is how it looks from the outside. Some technical details. This is how these pavilions are on the slope. It is important to mark that the terrain is sloping as the natural terrain is sloping. So this line of glass is not really stopping anything. The terrain flows into the house. It's a continuous sloping structure, juxtaposed with these pavilions and with these mushroom columns which carry the whole structure. So some interior views towards the entrance, how it looks in the section, the pavilions, staircases, and some more views. Also some sustainability issues. I will come to that later on in another project, but we, since let's say 2010, we start to deal with sustainability on different levels and different scales. And we work with a Serbian firm from Belgrade called NTech, and we have really a very reliable support and partners with them. So this is the finishing image. So now three residential structures. This is how people try to build in Croatia, and they somehow flatter to these structures urban villas. And it's easy to show that neither urban from the character of the place and the house, nor of villa-like private setting, but they are simply accumulations of building material, as I call it. And how to cope with that? So this is what we obviously do not want. So we reassess all these building volume of course, the same building volume. We cannot afford to have less because the developer wouldn't buy it. So we somehow try to appropriate this volume into a couple of stripes which somehow topographically follow the sloping terrain. So this is the idea of the project. Everything else is just the elaboration of this idea. So I will go very quickly through that. There are a number of other hidden themes that are not so important, but just to give you an idea how we can reappropriate the scale into something else to create a certain neighborhood-like setting between the slabs or these fingers, however you call them. Another one is made, it was a very interesting competition for the gypsies in the city of Zagreb. The city of Zagreb found this plot just next to this completely illegal settlement of gypsies. And it was a kind of a virginal plot of land, but gypsies as they are, as they built, didn't know that there is a competition there. So what did they do? In the meantime, they built some houses. So it was a kind of a very cynical brief of the competition saying, erase these houses, take a bulldozer, take it out and make a cultural center for them. So we thought it's a very cynical position that we cannot advocate. So we said, let's make a kind of an amnesty for most of these buildings, these really small scale objects, and let's try to introduce something in between. So we tried different ideas. This was too thin, it didn't work, so we opted for this solution. We somehow inserted this public program within this residential structure. Maybe it's mostly obvious in this image. There are very simple sheds that you can buy in a store, install there, and relation within this wall and these more private things, and of course emphasis on a public space that somehow is articulated between these houses. So this is most important because gypsies have this very, I would say, traditional way of living and celebrating, so we thought that this sort of relation could be appropriated for them. Final residential project in the outskirts of Zagreb in a very nice setting between two river flows. There was a piece of land. Again, the client wanted these blocks, but we said, no, we'll make some clusters. So we worked with this semi-detached housing type. We reworked it into something which we eventually called rural mat. Rural because the setting is rural, mat related to the famous theories of Allison and Peter Smithson, somehow something very compressed, something of a very clear perimeter, inward bound and repetitive. So these are, according to my reading of the Smithsons, the most important parts of the mat building. So we tried to work with them and to, as you can see here, to go from this archetype into something different but somehow reshuffled. So this is one of the clusters. Also emphasizing the free space because it still is part of a land outside the city. So we have the terraces, we have the atria, we have the gardens on the outside. We have a variety of open private spaces which are related to this sort of a, we call it single family housing in the group. We compress and condense the qualities of a single things into a more condensed and compressed structure. Also with some carports to take the half of the cars away from the street. So this is the setting, some views in the model, the idea of having barbecues here on the terrace. We even produced this prefab barbecue because we couldn't find a better one in the market, so we made this one and you can buy it, and this marketing name NJIRIC Plus. If you have interest, you can order it. It's still in the shops. So this is the idea to put them there. Some renderings showing these mats, the higher one and the lower one. These lower ones are 1 story dug into the ground and slightly of different configuration. And this is what we particularly liked. I'm sorry that it's so blurred. To have this small scale structure repeated. So this was very important for us to enter this granulation of the existing semi-urban, semi-rural setting and to address it with our little settlement. So this is how it looked like. always related to the center of the village with a church and all these different entrances. Every apartment has different individualized entrance. One over the staircases, one direct, one over the patio, and one directly here. Some more details of the project. And finally, we have L and XL, so I'll finish in 10 minutes, I hope. You have enough patience for that. So I'm giving you some very quick examples. A campus, a new university campus in the city of Zadar. This is the existing historical core, and this is the former military land, which has been taken over by the state of Croatia and custom for the new campus. So we won the competition for the campus and for the library, somehow trying to see how we can get these scales on that side, these modernist slabs, taking them here, and these sort of a single family house structure, taking them into like little towers of residential character, which would enable this campus to live 24/7. With some public space in between, and so on and so on. I cannot go into the detail. This is the idea of the library, this old Rossian idea that the public house that looks nice could be anything, just like a collection of nice spaces that after becoming obsolete as a library can become a hotel or a market or a mall, or you name it. This is the structure. We have this heavily installed perimeter, we have the library, and we have these punched holes, these atria, entrance atria, and two more. So, and this is what I particularly wanted to show you, because we see it as a kind of a scale-less structure, because you cannot say how many stories you have, how high it is. Is a person high like that, or high like that, or even smaller? So we like this idea that this building has timeless and scale-less qualities. At least we hope so. It has no windows, everything is hidden behind. It's also a kind of proto-sustainable building that somehow has this sort of a unclear date of production. And after, let's say, a decade, it would be even more confusing. Here you can see this thing what I told you already, the perimeter, the sloping structure of the library, and the atria, which somehow give light and provide enough lighting in for the reading purposes and things like that. And finally, extra large. I'll show you three things, just one slide of each. This is the idea of, this is a competition for a city of Pula in the Istrian Peninsula, where they actually asked us to do a little riva here. But we thought that it would be more important to have a kind of encounter with the whole city, and the idea that we can use the water as the site. So our site is not just the solid ground, but also the water. So we try to treat them equally with, as you can see, a lot of different scale structures, small scale, big scale, movable, fixed, also with this existing shipyard that has to be remodeled, with a lot of things, relation to the Roman arena and things like that. So this is the first one. The second one is a city in Rijeka, a new delta complex, where we try to make a kind of a piece of a city related with these blocks that somehow reiterate the idea of a typical Fiume block of the 19th century. And trying to also, with a lot of different structures that I cannot go into the detail now, to equip the whole part of the city with sufficient things, not to forget this huge sewer plant which has to be removed from here into kind of a floating structure and things like that. And the final project that I will show you tonight is a project that actually deals with the biggest area. It has 90 hectares. It's in the city of Zagreb, and it's a new university campus. We won the competition in 2011, made the UPU, the master plan, in 2013, and the first competitions are being held just now. So it's also a kind of former military land, which has been given over to the Republic of Croatia. And the competition actually asked for a very sustainable solution. So here you see the different campuses in the city of Zagreb, and this is the one that we had to deal with a relation to the two existing ones, dealing with forestry, land cultivation, and things like that. An old idea by architect Antolić from 1947, where he said the city of Zagreb should profit from these green fingers showing the fresh air, bringing the fresh air from the mountain into the city. So we will actually draw on his drawing, making one of these fingers going all the way to the river. So this was the idea, to have this consequence of spaces, ending up with our proposal for a new Olympic site just next to the river, also including this gypsy settlement, if you remember when I show it to you. So like a kind of a continuum of green spaces taking you to the river. This was a kind of a big picture. So I think, I'm sorry to bother you with that, but I think it's very important to read it, because this is our entrance text, and sometimes just to give you a hint that architects, or I think so, should sometimes write. So I'll read it for you. In the country with the lowest expenditure in public education in Europe and worst policies exercised by related ministries for decades, it's not likely to expect any building activities in the near future. The whole campus initiative has a disgusting political pre-election flavor and will probably soon be forgotten. However, it would be wise to take the advantage of the available site and to preserve it for a future in the form of a public park, and eventually build some houses. So this is our entrance text, and our sustainability engineers said, you are crazy, you certainly won't win the competition with such offense to the people who were behind the competition. But unluckily he was wrong, so we won the competition even with that. And we related this park to an existing park from 1794 called Maximir, so we call it Park B, as a park and eventually with some houses. So this is our master plan with 3 flowers full of clusters with a lot of energy issues that I will show you just now. So these are the layers of the project. When you have such a 90-hectare site, then you have to work with some auxiliary things like layering. One of the layers, the clusters, the public space, the paths, the waterways, and atomized little residential structures, all somehow, and the forest, which has these climatic things. This is the first project where we became aware that sustainability is much more efficient in the territory than in the building. In the building, you can think about some solar collectors or PV panels, or maybe even some wind turbines, or this is it. But in a territory which is much more bigger, you can apply certain sustainability rules in a with much bigger effect. I will show you just now what it is. So this is the idea of urbanism as a kind of a sequence, a process. You start with the site, you grow the meadow, you grow the trees, you cut the stripes, you put the water, you start building the first cluster, you put a bit of a public space, and you keep on building until the final saturation. So urbanism is not about a petrified image. Urbanism is more like kind of a continuous process. This is about the paths. It's not so important. The Schwarz plan, showing the built structure versus the non-built structures. The idea of these different green structures superimposing. Some views of the whole structure. The excerpt from a competition brief said, give us the future. And we somehow try to follow it by looking a bit at the past, particularly at this great project by Frank Lloyd Wright, the Broadacre City, which somehow has also this productive landscape that we somehow also try to suggest here. Like a kind of a crazy mixture of waterways, of athletic tracks, of clearings of the wood, of the wooden structures, of the clusters, of these atomized residential structure, of leisure activities, all somehow happening on every quadrant. Is a different story and in a constant flux. You can use the waterways to ice skate in winter. You might ask what this curious object is about. I will tell you just now. Or you can paddle in this water in summer. But then we come again to this idea of the scale. So this scale is so vast that the houses really do not have any height, as you can see. when you draw these little sections, they are so minimal. There's nothing like a kind of a landmark that you can use. So we invented these things, like these flying objects, like flying clouds above this campus structure, like a kind of a flock of objects that you can navigate with your smartphone, if you want, and you can use them for a number of purposes. This is this flying object, and funny enough, we found a startup company just 1 kilometer away from our building site who produces this for meteorological purposes. So we somehow worked with them in order to orchestrate these flying objects to perform for us. So they have this structure, they can provide light, they can provide sound, they can provide shadow, they can even observe like a big brother, they can perform a number of functions that we even do not know right now, but somehow the idea that you can somehow organize this floating part of your layout, urban layout, was something completely new for us and also for the whole competition. So you can see them, for example, here, more or less accumulated here where the public zone is. These are the clusters and things like that. And finally, this sustainability issue that we use basically the different part of plantation in order to protect the houses in the winter with some evergreen trees on the back side, and to put the trees that leave leaves on the south side, so in the winter they lose the leaves and they let this warm winter sun penetrate the clusters and to warm them up as necessary. Then we use phytopurification of the water in order to have this complete sewage system rethought anew. Here is the so-called CFD analysis, computational flow dynamics, where you can see how the clusters perform without the forest. And this is a significantly lower temperature when the forest is applied to the layout. So just by planting strategically right, we can address our plant. The same goes for acoustics. We also use some geothermal energy in a limited amount, because this is a kind of a water protected area, but somehow we use them and we put them into our complete scenario. These are the things that you are probably more familiar with. This is one of the clusters with these lamellas flowing into it. If you remember the pharmacy project, it has the same structure, the same principle. It's in a winter where the sun is much lower, works the same. And this is the most important diagram showing the orchestration of all these sustainable methods summed up. And you can see that for the heating from renewable sources, we have almost 2/3 of consume covered. For the cooling, we are almost there. And for electricity, we also can cover almost 2/3 of demanded consume. These are some rules that you have applied to every single clusters, how it can be performed later on by competitors in the competition. These are the simulations, how they can look like, these lamellas within the bigger structure. So again, a question of scale. The bigger scale of this cluster, which performs like a flower by having 6 clusters, and within the cluster you have this smaller scale structure with the streets, with different ambience that are always different and interesting for the teachers and for the children. Some views of elevation, view from the existing from the residential tower, which becomes a part of this cluster, again to ensure the presence of people 24/7 on the campus. View from this drone or from this cloud, in order to see how these can perform with this forest. And finally, the image how the classrooms can look like, and relation between these lamellas and the space in between, which has this in-between temperature and takes advantage of this greenhouse effect. And final image of a competition exhibition. Just after the Finnish competition, they organized an exhibition, and we somehow managed to put one of these floating structures in this exhibition space, just to show that the future is just around the corner. Thank you very much.
Hrvoje's wish is to speak with the audience, so now we will open up for questions.
Hi.
Hello.
By the way, fantastic presentation, and your office seems to be working with quite a lot of projects and to really have a lot of going on all the time. And I was wondering, how much time would you say approximately you're using on the projecting part? Would you say like, okay, this is the competition and this is the end result? Like, how much time would you say that you're using on that idea mingling?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for your flattering comments. Then I have to maybe disappoint you because the times are tough. And in Croatia, it really became very tough to perform our profession. More or less, everything ends up in a public bidding. So the competitions are becoming less and less. You know, javna nabava. You have it also here, I guess. So public bidding is the death of architecture, right? So when you are exposed to that, and when you earn maybe a third of what you normally should earn according to some efforts that you put into the project, then you have to minimize this working process. So most of the projects are somehow still taking advantage of the times where being an architect in Croatia was a kind of a pretty comfortable thing to do and to enjoy. Especially in the first decade of the 21st century, we had a very good situation with the competitions, and even for the young people, it was quite open and quite good to take part in this competition, to win, to build their first house, and so on. Nowadays, it becomes less and less, and I completely understand your question, and I can only tell you that for a competition, we normally take 2 months of elaboration, and when I say that, it means 2 or 3 people working on that all the time. And also, as you can see in some of the later projects with our counterparts, especially regarding the sustainability, because this is a kind of a terra incognita. This is something that we have to work with someone else. So we rely on them, and they somehow use at least 1 month to work on these concepts. So I would say from 2.5 to 1 month. Recently, we are doing a competition now. I can only afford to have 1 person working on it, and let's say me for 1/5 of my working time. So we have to minimize it. It's inevitable. But somehow, by practicing and establishing certain principles, and I hope that you have seen some sort of logic behind this project, then you can rely on certain knowledge that you have already, right? So if you are a bit more experienced, then it can be quicker. But sometimes, still, every project has to have a certain history, a certain story to tell, right? Sometimes you can get it instantly, sometimes you don't get it at all. So, of course, we have the better and less good projects, but somehow it is very important. It has nothing to do with the time. There is a certain point where you see that the story is good enough that it can be told, and that these who you address this story to will eventually understand.
Is it work? Yeah, thank you very much. But I'm so sorry. I'm just curious about one more thing, yes, and it please. Is the relationship between space and the material, the tectonic part in your architecture. Because I've seen that you've come into it, but you were jumping out of it and then going back again. So you were kind of like mixing it up.
It is very important, but I will also try to answer it strategically. First, we look at what is transparent and what is not. If you take this kindergarten that we built, it is not symmetrical, because on one hand side, on 3 hand sides, you have the park. On one hand side, you have the public street. So we said, okay, we'll do this closed structure, but we will cut away this facade on the street, and we will glaze it. So we will use it as a kind of a glazed section in order to relate the people strolling along the street, going to the tram every morning, and to relate it to the kindergarten as a kind of a direct relation. So And it is also, I can tell you an anecdote, when my son spoke to his colleagues, they said, you know how they call this kindergarten? They call it pedophile supermarket. Because it's transparent and everybody can take what they want, you know. But first you have to be strategical about it. Of course there are blinds, louvers, you can shut the view if you really have this sort of paranoia, which goes on in Croatia pretty much at the moment. So every time I have some guests, and I guess there were some people also from Banja Luka University visiting our kindergarten, so I'm happy about that. So every time we have the guests, we have to announce it to the director, and they have to give us special permission when the kids are not sleeping, and so on and so on. So it's important to be strategical about the elevations. But then in the final tectonics, again, on one hand side, it is strongly related to sustainability. I think it's very important to have the facades that can perform well, or double skin facade, or house within the house, whatever you call it. So I think this is very important. And on the other hand side, the economy of means. In other words, we have to be very economical about the facades. We cannot afford to have something luxurious. We cannot have Schuko windows and things like that. We have to stay in this low key whenever we build, and it is not so easy. It's a big struggle. So when it comes to this final finish of the building, then we have a lot of problems recently. Thank you. Yes, please.
Okay. Hi. I also want to give you a compliment about your projects, and that you went through all the phases and all the users, and that you connected them. And to give you a compliment for the examples at the beginning of the presentation, for the relations between small and big scale. But I want to ask you if I see that you went through big and small scale through your project, but was there a situation when you had to choose which scale you have to push more, if you understand me? Like you have small scale users like children, or some for example, small scale is a room, and big scale is, for example...
I get you some small scale.
Small scale, for example, is a room for children in this kindergarten, and big scale is a park you gave to the citizens. But you choose the both. But was there a situation where you had to push one thing? And why, and what did you choose? For example, when we did our structure on the River Urbas, we took both, but we maybe in some time need to use small scale users. We choose them in some parts because it was the best option. So I was wondering, what did you use, small or big scale? What did you choose, small or big scale, and what and why?
Okay, it's pretty complicated to answer it very quickly, but thank you for the question. On one hand side, very banal, it depends on the site. When you have a small site for a single family house, then you do what you can on that site. But when you have a campus or things like that, then of course there should be a kind of a sequence of scales which somehow moderate this idea of public space and how these buildings perform. And one very important thing for us is, as you can see it in some of our projects, is that sustainable housing, sustainable buildings should have a kind of a compact envelope. The less envelope, the better, right? So this is why we try to work with these sort of continuous glass houses and to put things within them in order to address these energy issues the best way we can. And I think from, let's say, if we observe architecture as a pure artistic discipline, which is obviously not happening so often nowadays, then of course there should be a number of other decisions that should drag you to this or that side. But generally I think it's about your feeling about a certain site, you know, and how do you relate it to the program. I wouldn't say necessarily that it only has to do with kids. You can do a small-scale program even for an office structure. Now we are doing this competition for a kind of a offices for state hydrometeorologic station. And we try to work within, if you're familiar with the work, the structuralist work of Hermann Herzberger, then you know that he works in different projects with these small-scale objects which are interrelated in order to facilitate and to make a humane relation between the working people in an object, right? So this can also be a reason to go into this kind of small structure to make it more, to give them a bit more humane scale. So there is no prescription. I think you should simply try to follow your intuition, if not the things like sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was good, thank you.
Since we are running out of time, just a kind request. Tell us a bit about the fireplace design.
How?
A fireplace design. We would like to hear more about it.
Okay, it is a sad story, actually. So we shouldn't finish with that. We were kind of desperate. We really wanted to have these barbecues on the terrace with all these chimneys going up, because it's when you do it later and when you buy it in these markets, which are not probably much better than we have in Croatia, then you have a lot of these kitsch things that look awful on the terrace. So we wanted to solve it firsthand with a developer and to install them from the beginning. And this was the reason why we choose a partner to work on this, let's say, relatively minimal design of a new barbecue. And the producer went with us into it, but the client, it was a Russian client. The Russian client changed his mind in the last moment. So they are in the renderings, but they're not in the reality. So it remained like a kind of a singular object that you can buy, and they say that they are selling certain amounts of quantities of it. But I'm sorry about the project, because this could have been not just a formal issue, but the gesture, how to use this outer space, how to use it in a bit more relaxed manner and within a certain formally controllable situations.
Okay, do we have more questions? So we have more questions. Can you just give him the micro? You can speak loudly, maybe.
Yeah.
We will be able to hear you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, if we see all of your projects, in a way you develop your own style dealing with all these different spatial problems, let's say. So, do you recognize your own patterns in working with such different projects from different scales to different programmatic projects?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I think it's very important. I'm not happy to be recognized as someone who has a style. Maybe you can see it graphically or in some methods, but maybe I'm wrong. But I think that every project is a challenge per se. It gives you a chance to develop certain interests. Of course, we are in this time when sustainable development became almost like a kind of a obligatory in Croatia when you're doing the competitions, and also all the houses should be carbon neutral by 2030, you know that. So we have to train ourselves to be working towards LEED Gold or whatever you call it. So this is definitely some sort of methods. So if we have a certain if you have a certain familiarity with some of our project, then I would say it comes back to the methods. Of course, every architect has its own formal agenda as well. But somehow we try to push these things, these formal things, and also a kind of a handwriting. I think it's very important, and I also try to train my students in that sense, to step away from your architectural libido, you know, to take away your handwriting and to somehow to strip bare the bare necessities of the project. Of course, it's a very heavy task and you cannot always live up to that expectations, but still I think it's a noble goal to follow, and I try to follow it. That, as you maybe you have seen this project for Zadar Library, when we wanted really to erase any sort of handwriting. We want, our ideal is to make a house that someone can doubt whether there was an architect behind that or not. You know, this would be our supreme goal to achieve, that this architecture just happened. It was needed, it just happened, it is there, and nobody knows why and when and so on. So I'm the last one that would like to be recognized for the style. But of course, when you work in a couple of decades, one after the other, then certain, I would say, methods and working patterns are being repeated.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
What's your favorite medium? Sketch, render, diagram, or the plan?
Very good question. Thank you very much on that. I had a lecture 3 days ago in Zagreb. I was asked to have a little dialogue with public, and the lecture was named "Some Hints for the Future." And one of the most important hint is, I call it digitocracy. It is about this new time that is not around the corner, it's already there. On one hand side, you have this BIM technology, which we have to face with sooner or later. On the other hand side, you have the social media. I think that the social media is the strongest thing that happens in architecture today. Social media like Facebook or Twitter will shape the future architecture to such an incredible extent that you can not even imagine that. And there are architects who are already embracing this medium to promote themselves. I was foolish enough 4 years ago to be to go into this Facebook, because a colleague of mine told me, if you get your Facebook profile, you will get some more work. It doesn't happen like that. It's not enough to open the account and to put some pictures in your Facebook profile. You have to use it as a tool. And it's also a kind of a creative method how to work with Facebook to make it as a kind of a tool that promotes your work and addresses certain group of people, age group, interest group, political group, whatever you call it, depraved group, right? We even worked for LGBT for some time. So I think that nowadays we have to embrace this new era, which somehow, again, dissolves this handwriting. I used to sketch a lot in the past, and I somehow stopped. On one hand side, because the handwriting was so clear that everyone who hates us recognized us in the competition, so I had to somehow stay away from that. On the other hand side, it's a kind of it is still a kind of reliable thing to make a diagram, to promote and to mediate your idea very quickly to the jury in a competition, to your client, to the developer. So I think that these analog methods will still remain visible. I think that, for example, this sort of sketching and diagramming and animating this in GIFs, what, for example, Bjarke Ingels is doing, is completely relevant, and he's still working on in this, I would say, primitive level with a lot of success, of course. But I somehow put much more faith into this new digital media that are coming, and that we will have to learn how to use it to our advantage. Thank you for a nice question. Yes. First of all, this is the competition that we didn't win. We came third, but the one that won made this, it's really incredible. They made this Ceausescu, you know Ceausescu, this old guy, who put people, the cows in the tower on the 9th floor. They had a farm and things like that. So they made these sort of towers for them, which are completely nonsense, of course. We came third, but later on I had some chance to speak to some Roma people, and they all liked this concept very much. They liked it very much, and I was very, very happy to get this sort of feedback. Later on, we did for a Swedish company, I've forgotten the name, who make this sort of a beneficiary work and promotion of such, and we applied for the grant with the project of a Roma kindergarten. And we somehow tried to get our experience from the work that I've shown you with this experience of Roma people. Of course, not to make a kindergarten for them, but to make a kindergarten for, let's say, Croatian children and all other children, minorities, Roma, or from some other ethnicities. So we wanted to make a kind of a kindergarten which is a platform for this multicultural interface between them, and somehow to learn about equality, to learn about the necessity of dialogue, and to listen to the people who do not look completely like you do. So we put a lot of love and a lot of efforts into this. It wasn't competition, it was a kind of a bidding. And we went to their seminars, and out of these 100 proposals, we came into the last round, the last 3, and we lost in this last round. I'm really sorry about that, because it was really tricky to make it in a very limited and tight budget that this company had. But it was a very nice experience somehow to combine these ideas from the social background of working with Roma people, knowing them, and on the other hand side, how to work for this space for the kids. So it was really in spite of our failure at the end, it was a very, I would say, rewarding experience. You're welcome.
So, do we have more questions? Okay, one more.
This is a very personal question, but I'll try to answer it the best way I can. I think it needs a lot of work on yourself, first of all. And I entered some groups which work with energy in order to build down my ego as a person, not just like an architect. And I think it helped me a bit, that I really do not regard myself as something outstanding or better than my counterpart, and that I really can afford myself to step away from this handwriting, you know. And it takes a lot of effort. I don't think I'm really there. Maybe some Swiss architects try to be there. I really cannot name a single one that really succeeded on a continuous level to produce such a substantial work that has this 0 degree handwriting. But somehow you think you have to start from yourself. You have to try to reorganize yourself in your everyday life to be, try to be a kind of a generous, attentive person. And then eventually it can be transposed into architecture as well. And of course, you can put certain things on automatic, as we call it, by the creative part is, say, we'll put these and these strategies together. And this is the creative part. And let's see how they work. Let's see how they interconnect, how they fertilize each other, you know. And let's see, and let's monitor the process that it doesn't spill over the table, right? So let's keep it on the table. So we try to see how these strategies work. translated to understand, it means I give to some collaborators, you work on that, you try this, and let's see how we can somehow orchestrate that and maintain some sort of the idea. One important thing that I've forgotten, I think it's important to share with you and maybe to hear if you agree with me, it's a kind of a discourse. I have a lot of problems with my students all over to let them understand what the discourse is about. So what is this procedure behind the project that I think that it's essential that it exists. You cannot simply say this is a building. A lot of architects who do these sort of lectures say this is the building, this is the basement, the ground floor, the attic, the sections and things like that. So there should be a bit more. There should be some sort of added value in this project, right? So I think that this discourse is very important. So back to your question. When you have a discourse and when you have certain patterns and strategies, I think this will do. And then you can even afford that some collaborator or even the building company finishes the design. So this is the idea. And how good can we work within this is very different from project to project. You're welcome. Sad možemo onda ništa. Ako imate ništa.
I will have one question and then and then we will finish. I read in one of your texts, as architects need to write sometimes, no, and you asked how to stage the future for the society with no fate for tomorrow. Are this slide that you just showed us means that we are closer to the exit for the future or not?
This is especially for Croatian society, which is really maybe you can sympathize with that.
Let's refer to the region.
Actually, the text was for the Rijeka Delta project, because it's really very annoying what happens there. They have a mayor for, it's like a kind of a, he thinks that it's a kind of a lifelong merit, that he should be there as long as he lives. And it's a very bad situation. Nothing has been done in Rijeka since decades. So we entered, it was a competition, yeah. So we entered the competition with very mixed emotions, you know. So we said how to motivate ourselves and the clients and the developers in such a annoying situation that we have in Rijeka. How to motivate yourself to work as an architect with someone who really does not want you to work with him. So you have to invent some sort of strategies. You have to motivate yourself to come out with some solutions, knowing that there is no client, actually. There is no client. There might be eventually some foreign developer that might take up with some ideas, but working without the client when everything and nothing is possible, I think this is a very challenging task, you know. It's a very challenging task, how to work in this sort of situation. Generally speaking, I think it's working in a greenfield investment is much more difficult than if you have a very, I would say, obliging context, which somehow says this should be like that, this should be higher than that. So if you have obstacles and constraints, then you can work a bit easier. But if you are completely liberated, you can do whatever you want, then you have some problems. And then if you even don't have an investor, then it's a very tricky thing to do. But somehow we managed to elaborate some things, to elaborate some problems that they even didn't think of. So we finished the project. We came to this last three that were told that we should prepare the projects and then the developers will bid and see who wins. And it didn't happen. They just put the project in the shelf, gave us some money, and this is it. And it's the situation lasts for 5 years now. And yeah, this is the bad fate of this Rijeka project, but I'm happy that in such an unusual situation that we somehow managed to elaborate a certain procedure and strategy.
Well, thank you.